So I've been on the left side of things economically my entire life, and I partially attribute that to the fact that both of my parents were on that side of things, and that I grew up in an area where virtually everyone who wasn't my parents was resoundingly on the conservative side, the ultra conservative side of things economically. And so our household was this kind of odd enclave or island of progressivism amidst a sea of far right libertarian or classically liberal economic ideology. But I also saw how particular social programs like food stamps and Medicaid had greatly enhanced my life. Food stamps was the reason why we were able to consistently eat every month, even though poor mismanagement of my mother's finances end up leading to not as much food being around near the end of the month. We still had a lot for most of the month because of that program, whereas without it, we wouldn't have anything at all. Because of Medicaid, I was able to consistently go to my doctor's appointments. I was able to get ablation for my SVT, where they had to manually stop my heart and then burn off the defective valve and then have it fixed. I had to stay in the hospital for days and days because of that. Because of Medicaid, my dental care was literally free. We had to pay no money, and that was because it was a dentist that actually accepted Medicaid. Because of Medicaid, I never had to pay $1, not 1 cent, for my prescription medications. And so I had been going in and out of the ER due to getting the flu growing up. At one particular point, I had to be put on a breathing machine, and I almost died. I hadn't even turned 10 years old at the time, and I almost died from having had the flu. And I pretty routinely would have to be put on antibiotics for strep throat because strep throat was something I'd get over and over and over again, and I would have it for like 2 weeks sometimes, and it was just awful every time I got sick. So in addition to the pre-existing conditions that I had, also the illnesses that I would get and just how threatening they would become to my livelihood made me appreciate that social safety net, the free health care that I was able to get because of the income bracket that I was in. And of course, when you're in poverty, the food assistance makes a massive difference as well. The social security my mom received for working much of her life, she literally worked since she was 7 years old in my grandfather's restaurant. Because of that social security she received for working so long and being disabled by her epilepsy, we were able to have the money that we needed for basic things. And this social safety net was what was created in the wake of the New Deal and LBJ's Great Society programs that went on to supersede the New Deal, that went on to build on the foundations left with that. And so I look at all of this taken together, and I come to understand why I would be more on the left side of things economically. And I've never budged from that position. There has never been a time in all of the various iterations of my ideology that there have been when I've flip-flopped on particular issues, like a matter such as gun regulation. I've never budged on my fundamental economic philosophy, which is that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that the absolute best way to raise that tide is to have redistributive economics, be it through the state or through some more local, directly democratic institutions that don't necessarily adhere to the mechanisms of the state. But in both cases, I was resoundingly on the side of redistributive economics. I just, as time has gone on, not been entirely sure as to how to get there, but when posed with the alternative of capitalism, no matter how bad the allies I've sided with I've thought are, I've always sided with the ones that nominally at least opposed capitalism, unless they're like fascists, which in the case of those guys, no, they don't oppose fascism, because in all the historical examples of that ideology we've seen, they have massively deregulated in certain regards, like bringing back child labor laws in Italy is a great example. Some people claim that that ideology is at least nominally anti-capitalist or redistributive in essence, but I don't think that the people who claim that have almost any understanding of the history behind that ideology historically. So, for the sake of being clear, let's exclude those people out of potential allies that I have had or currently have, okay? So, because of those social programs, because of that social safety net, I'm alive today, and there's a very good chance that I would either be in much more debt than I am or not alive at all without that social safety net, which is a serious thing to ponder, and I'm sure you can imagine why. And I think this bridges into my broader point as to why I've also always had an opposition to so-called small government, because even when I was calling myself an anarchist for a brief time, I, whenever asked about what I meant by that, would expressly mention that I still supported, at least in the near term, the greater enlargement of government for certain purposes or in certain ways. And I would explain why I wanted that. I had a very bizarre, abstract series of reasons. I wanted government to be enlarged up to a certain point until eventually it would gradually wither away by the time that society had progressed to a point where they could actually handle the administrative tasks required to prevent things like child abuse or abuse of the system, which is precisely where I'm headed towards with this explanation. I have had a strong dislike for small government, I think primarily because small government failed me. My parents were allowed to homeschool me with virtually no oversight, and as a result of that, I ended up becoming someone who was socially inept, uneducated, and underprepared for what the real world would require of me. And this created a situation where I ended up having to take responsibility for how the system had failed me. Like, I've had to pick up the slack and teach myself all of this stuff when it was no fault of my own as a child that I had been neglected. But there are no institutional mechanisms by which the state can take corrective measures on parents that happen to just not teach their kid anything. There's not a way that that can be done, at least where I lived in Tennessee. And so, by outlawing homeschooling, except in very, very specific circumstances that you have to go through 1,000,001 hoops to be approved for, by doing that, we can effectively prevent situations like mine from happening. And that requires a net expansion of the state, because what you're doing is taking away that more decentralized approach that we currently have that I think creates situations like mine where you're homeschooled but you're not taught anything. You're homeschooled but you're not prepared for the world. And that is one of the main reasons that I've been against small government. I also think that there are certain tasks that simply cannot be left up to private industry. Things like administration of the environment and the broader regulatory apparatus That's hitherto. I think resource management at large, the water system is a great example of this, but also fossil fuels. These things are too large and too important to be left up to the market, too vital to the economy. And if we look at what's going on with, for example, the nuclear power plant that I grew up nearby, I would drive by that somewhat regularly in the forest that I lived in. And I'd see the smokestacks going up. I'd look up at the clouds and it just looked kind of blah. And I thought, isn't there a better way to do this? Now, what I didn't understand at the time was that nuclear actually is better than many of the existing alternatives, but there are also alternatives to nuclear that are better than nuclear. And I felt kind of perturbed by that being in our backyard. It wasn't literally in our backyard, but you know what I mean, metaphorically. It bothered me. Our air quality was fine, but when you would drive by that spot, it didn't look as fine, just based on the way that it looked. You'd see it going up into the air, and you just feel sort of bad about it. And so that experience and thinking about it informs my views on the environment as well, and on natural resources, which also requires a net expansion of the state, and also could be potentially redistributive in how such a system would be organized. But when we talk about doing things on climate change on a large scale, you almost have to have these things taken away from private industry. And I don't see any real benefit to having them in the hands of private industry in the first place when, with the oil industry, for example, we produce more than any other country on Earth, and yet the majority of the oil is going overseas only for us to then buy oil from the OPEC countries. It doesn't make any sense. Why not just keep it in-house and use the enhanced resources of the state to speed up, to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels? So there's a variety of experiences that I've had that inform my views in the modern day. And I think that's the case for everybody, but in my case in particular, it's led me to be pretty squarely on one particular side. And if anyone wonders why, no matter where I've been on some particular social issues, I always seem to say many of the same things about economic ones. That's why. Also foreign policy, because I don't have an experience to point to with foreign policy, but I do have a particular memory to point to with foreign policy from my childhood that I think had a great effect on me. I was learning from my mom about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about the nuclear bomb. And when I learned that humanity could create such a catastrophic device, I felt myself recoil. I felt disgusted at my own species. And from that point forward, I wanted nothing but the complete and total reduction of armaments to almost zero. And that is still how I feel to this day. From learning about that from a big old history book when, I had to have been like 7 at the time when my mom was teaching me what the nuclear bomb was. I literally cried when she told me what the nuclear bomb was. I just cried. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand that such a thing would exist. And from that point forward, I knew that something had to change, that the military all over the world had to be decreased, the military presence rather. And I feel a little uncomfortable just thinking about it still right now. That ended up informing my foreign policy positions. That experience of learning about that. I was affected so strongly by it that I just knew that empire in all of its forms had to be quelled. I went on to study history a lot more after that too, as I got older. And studying history, learning about the economic transformation in the wake of the New Deal and the various atrocities that occurred throughout history by so many different empires, learning about these events only made me more resolute in the ideological trajectory that I was already on. And that continues to be the case the more that I learn.